Right. A little bit easier for everybody if I do that. Okay, so we are on chapter 11 now. Um, so originally, I know I had 14 modules listed. I never do a full 14 module semester. I usually just list them all out so that people can see what's available. And then toward the end of the semester, I usually pick from among the remaining um, the remaining modules. So I usually only do between 10 and 12 modules per semester. So I know it looks like we're not doing a whole lot of work because we've done 8 chapters so far and we're going to do another 2. So that's 10. And that's usually about as many, between 10 and 12. It depends on the course. I mean, it depends on how much time we spend discussing things and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit different in person than it is online. But I never plan to do more than 10 or 12, and we're going to get through 10 modules this semester. So I just wanted to let you know that we're not really behind. And for those of you who are expecting to get through all 14 modules, I apologize. It's never occurred to me because I'm usually teaching in person, and I can just explain this to the class, or we can talk about it. But it never occurred to me that people would expect to do the full 14 modules and then be upset if we didn't. So I apologize for the misunderstanding if there was one. But we are going to get through 10 modules. We're going to skip, the reason that I've chosen to skip the natural law theory and social contract theory is because those are kind of interesting and relevant for political philosophy. But when it comes to basic moral philosophy, we've got 3 primary types of theories that we're working with. We're working with consequentialist theories, deontological theories, and then virtue ethics theories. So those are really the 3 core elements of contemporary moral theorizing. And like I said, the social contract theory is really interesting in its relation to political theory. And natural law gets called upon a lot. That's kind of it's more like a Catholic religious. It's sort of came out of a Catholic sort of religious view. It's sort of a blend of Aristotelianism and Catholic theology. So some of the Supreme Court justices actually they're natural law theorists, right? So if you're interested in legal theory or political theory, those are going to be kind of interesting and relevant, perhaps. But just for the core of just in my clothes, just for the core of moral theory in philosophy, we're hitting the major parts, right? And the final chapter that we're going to do next week, which is the feminist care ethics, is actually a virtue theory. So we've gotten exposure to a range of different kinds of theories under these 3 main branches of contemporary moral theorizing. So I know that everything feels like chaos this semester, and I know that it looks kind of like chaos, but really we're on track in terms of covering material. So one of the things that is lacking when you do the online courses is you don't have constant interaction and engagement to keep you, I think, affirmed that that we are making progress and that we're learning a lot. And also the grading. I've gotten behind on the grading. Everybody I know is behind on the grading. In fact, they've been sending out emails through the department asking us to reconsider some of our grading and maybe adjust what we expect to grade and what we expect to just give people participation points for. So I'm in the process of doing that. I'm in the process of reevaluating. Am I going to give just participation points for whoever did the discussion board? Am I actually going to grade those? I think it's most important right now to get the exams graded, which is my goal for tomorrow, is to get everything graded. So, but keeping in mind that you didn't get feedback from your first exam, I'm certainly not going to hold that against you on your second exam. I'm actually a fairly easy grader. So, and this course usually has a B average. So you really don't have anything to worry about. I'm certainly not going to penalize you for anything that isn't, performance related. And even this semester probably won't penalize you for things that are performance related, because I know that everybody's been having a terrible, terrible time. This has been a terrible way to try to get an education and to try to give an education. So we're going to be kind. In fact, the president of the university keeps sending out emails through our department saying, we're going to be kind, we're going to be generous, and we're just going to get through this. So that's kind of always my mantra as a teacher, is to be kind and generous and to be as accommodating as possible for people. I know some of you have kids that have been learning from home, and that's extremely challenging. I know that some of you have had health problems, and I know that some of you have had family with health problems, and I know some of you have had mental health problems, because this is it's a really dark time. And we've been under quarantine, or we've been sort of socially isolating now for 9 months. That's a very long time. So I understand that this is less than ideal. I really do. And I am certainly not going to penalize you for the difficulties that we've all kind of been grappling with this semester. So let's get into the material. All right. A little something to drink. This time it's a cider. It's apple orange hard cider. That sounded kind of interesting. It's not really either apple or orange. It's kind of a tart. It's more like a tart. It's weird. That could just be me though. What? I have a couple things that I really like, but sometimes I'm like, I don't know, I'll try that. It seems interesting. And then I'm like, why did I do that? I just need to stick with what I like. Oh, I've got fruit flies. Okay, so let's talk about virtue ethics. All right, so as I said, I'm going to just go ahead and start with this again. There are 3 types of theories that are the predominant theories in contemporary moral theorizing. There's consequentialism, which we talked about. We talked about utilitarianism. We talked about act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Okay, so those are consequentialist theories. We talked about deontology. Deontology is a theory like Kant's theory. We looked at Kant in chapter 8. That's a deontological theory. Where do fruit flies come from? Like, seriously, I know they come with fruit from the grocery store or something, but you never see them until you get home, and then all of a sudden you've got like this explosion of like little fruit flies everywhere. Okay, so we've looked at consequentialisms, and we've looked at deontology. We've looked at one particular theory of deontology. It's a very, very prominent view. So these 2 kinds of theories, or theories that fall under these 2 sort of main headings, categories. I'm having a hard time speaking, apparently, tonight. So I'm going to try this again. So these 2 categories of moral theory, consequentialisms and deontology. We've looked at theories under each of those categories. And what these 2 categories have in common is that they are what we call rule-based moral theories. So, or principle-based. They're either rule-based or principle-based. The book calls it principle-based. We'll go with principle-based. So a principle-based moral theory is one that posits that there just are these rules that we adhere to, and that when we adhere to the rule, our actions are going to be morally right. Or if we don't obey the rule, then they're going to be morally wrong. So for the consequentialist theories, it's usually some sort of maximizing function. So the morally correct action is whatever's going to produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of sentient beings. Okay? So that's a principle. That's a moral principle. And sometimes these theories have very simple sets of principles, but they're still principles, right? So deontology. If you're a Kantian, and that's the view that we looked at, so we're just going to deal with Kantianism. Excuse me. if you're a Kantian, then you have to conform your behavior to the categorical imperative, right? So you don't want to. The categorical imperative just basically says you're not allowed to treat another person as a means, as merely as a means to an end, and that includes yourself, right? So you have to adjust all of your actions, your planning, what it is you're going to do. You have to filter all of that through the categorical imperative, and you have to sort out the things that are going to violate the categorical imperatives. Okay, so these are principles. The categorical imperative is a principle. So the principle of ends, it's a principle. Now, when we get into virtue ethics, we don't have principles anymore. This is a virtue-based theory. And what's different between a virtue-based theory versus a principle-based theory is that virtue-based theories have an emphasis, they place an emphasis on ways of being. And I know that sounds kind of vague, but you'll understand what I'm saying here. Think of the most virtuous person that you know. What is that person like? So maybe it's your grandmother, maybe it's your mom or your dad, maybe it's a teacher, could be a sibling, could be anybody you know, right? Could be some kind of a celebrity, right? Think about that. Who is the most virtuous person you know, and what are the kinds of character traits that make them the most virtuous person that you know? So let's think about this. Maybe somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. Somebody who, like, that's what I mean by a celebrity figure. I don't mean like Courtney Love or Pamela Anderson. Oh God, that's terrible. I mean, I'm sure that they have some redeeming qualities. I'm just being rude. Okay, so, but when we say virtuous people, we don't tend to think about rock stars and, people who sort of perform things for a living. I'm getting myself into some hot water here. We tend to think about people who are like religious, or we look at religious figures. Sometimes we can even look at like maybe even a sports figure like LeBron James. I mean, he's really active in social justice issues, right? So we're going to look at social justice leaders. We're going to look at people who, maybe even politicians. There might be some leaders, some political leaders who we consider to be very virtuous people. So I think a lot of people probably are going to say Barack Obama is a very virtuous man, and he has really outstanding character, right? Martin Luther King Jr., very virtuous, had some outstanding character. Now, does this mean they're perfect? No, it doesn't mean they're perfect. But we want to look at these people and we want to say, okay, what is it that we're flagging as virtue there? What does it mean to be virtuous in the sense that we're thinking about it? So let's just pick somebody. See, this is where if we were in class, I would just say, pick somebody, and then we would just go with whoever you picked. I just named two people, but let's keep going. Let's find some more people who we think are virtuous. I really liked Chadwick Boseman. I don't know if you guys know who he is, but he is the actor who played Black Panther. And he was really just a really outstanding human being. I didn't know him personally, of course, but just everything that I heard him say, things that he did, he carried himself really well. He seemed like he was always very kind. He was always gentle. He had wise things to say. He had really good advice to give people. He cared about social justice issues. So clearly, he cared about social justice issues. And I think that those are qualities that are admirable, right? And he did not seem to have at all a big attitude about being an actor or a celebrity and making money. He just seemed very humble and very full of gratitude for where he was. And then when we come to find out, the man's had been dealing with cancer for the last 4 or 5 years, and still producing the quality work that he did. I mean, when we think about people who are dealing with these hidden sort of issues that are what we would consider extremely difficult issues to deal with, and they're handling it with such grace. And they're not complaining, and like very few people even know. You can't tell this person is going through something that is a tremendous suffering, that produces tremendous suffering and fear and anxiety. And the fact that it wasn't until the day he died that we found out that he'd been so sick. It wasn't obvious in his behavior. That is somebody that I want to say, that is the very virtuous person. In fact, I'm not one who gets like really caught up with celebrities, but his death really bothered me. And it still bothers me to this day, because I think, man, he was such a good human being. He was such a quality human being, and he exuded just light. And I think it's so unfortunate that we're losing people like this, and yet here are these people in positions they should probably never have gotten into, who stir up hatred and division. And I think, why do we have these people, and why do we lose the good ones? It's just so sad. So okay, so he's kind, he's humble, it's like he's still alive to me. So kindness, humility, grace, generosity, wisdom, right? So we think about these things and we think these are really, really admirable character traits, and we call them virtues. So virtues are just these sort of positive character traits that we admire and that we want to emulate. And a character is kind of it's like I said, it's kind of a vague thing. It's just a way of being, right? So when we say somebody has good character, we're talking about the way that they just are, the way that a way of being in the world, right? So someone like Chadwick Boseman had a very virtuous way of being. He was full of grace, and kindness, and he was very gentle. He was a gentle spirit, so his way of being is very, very different than, say, Donald Trump's way of being. Donald Trump does not display any of those qualities. He displays a lot of characteristics that are the opposite of that, right? So he's very self-interested. He's not motivated by the good of others. He does not appear to be motivated by the good of others. He is childish. He won't even concede an election that he lost. So those traits are really sort of the opposite. He pitches a fit anytime somebody doesn't do something somebody does something he doesn't like. He gets on Twitter and he just fires off this storm of tweets, degrading other people's character just for disagreeing with him. Right? He's nasty. That is not a person who copes well with much in life. I mean, I can't even imagine. What if he had colon cancer? What if he was dealing with cancer and having to still manage a job like this? He can't even manage it on a good day. I can't imagine what he would be like if he was actually sick. I mean, he doesn't strike me as the kind of person who really has spent much time in his life developing virtue. He seems to be a person who's more vicious than virtuous. Now, a person who is vicious is a person who has a lot of vices, and vices are just negative character traits. Okay, so Donald Trump, I think, is a really great example of somebody who's fundamentally lacking in most virtues. He may have some that I'm not aware of because I don't know the man personally, but just from what I've seen over the last 4 years and being a moral philosopher, who I really do think that there's something interesting about virtue theory. There's something to it. I'm inclined to say that Donald Trump has very few virtues, and the list of vices is fairly long from what I can see. Okay, so virtue theorists are going to assume that all human behavior is going to be a direct product of the character of an individual. So your character is going to dictate your desires. What kind of person you are is going to dictate what you want out of the world, and what you want motivates your actions. So if you have good character, then you're going to be motivated to pursue good things, and your actions are going to be good. If you have bad character, then your actions are going to be motivated by bad things, and you're not going to produce much good in the world. Okay, so this is the underlying idea behind virtue theory. It's really pretty simple at its core. Now, once we start getting into more details, like with an Aristotelian theory that's in the chapter, things get a little bit more complicated, but really it's pretty simple. And it's pretty intuitive when you think about it. We tend to sort of treat people this way. It's like, well, a person of bad character, if we deem somebody to have bad character, we don't tend to want to be like them. We don't put them up as somebody to emulate. We don't seek out their mentorship or their approval. But people that we admire, who have what we think are good, positive character traits, those are the people that we want to emulate, the people that we want to mentor us, the people that we want to be around and to be like, right? So this is just a very natural way of being, right? This is the way human beings are. We gravitate to people that we think have good character. So one of the things that's interesting about virtue theories is that they're going to be a little bit different. Each one of them is going to be to have a different idea about what the core virtues are, right? So, and what's interesting too is that what is considered virtuous seems to change over time and across cultures. So Eastern philosophies, Asian philosophies, a lot of them are very virtue based. So Confucianism is a virtue based theory, and what's considered virtuous in Chinese culture is very different than what's considered virtuous in U.S. culture, contemporarily even, but especially historically, right? There's some divergence between between what we would consider virtuous and what an ancient Chinese family would consider virtuous, right? So it's hard to say exactly what the virtues are. Is there one set of virtues? And do we all need to conform to those virtues in order to produce good actions? So that's one thing to keep in mind about virtue theories, is that they're not all going to emphasize the same virtues, and those things fluctuate. Even so, over time, think about this. Here's an example. In the pre-Civil War South, it was considered virtuous to not be too harsh with your slaves. Well, yes, if they did something wrong, you can still beat them, but don't beat them excessively. Okay, it's like that John Smith. He's such a virtuous guy. His slave tried to run away, and he only gave him 10 lashes instead of 40. Wow, what a virtuous guy. I don't know if I could be that virtuous. Okay, nowadays we'd be like, how can you even consider somebody who owns another person a virtuous person? That seems to be a huge problem, right? If you don't recognize the humanity of another person and you don't respect the humanity of another person, that seems like a huge hole in your character. That seems very problematic. So nowadays we'd be like, that is not virtue. That is absolutely not virtue. That is vicious as vicious gets, right? Owning another person. Not recognizing the humanity and the autonomy of another individual. Okay, so that seems like not something that we would want to promote as a virtue today, but that is something that they thought was a virtue back then. All right. So is there this duck? As long as I'm talking, he has to be talking too. Sammy, hush. He has got his beak tucked under his wing, like he's gonna sleep, but he's quacking underneath there. Right. Okay, so you have to ask yourself, it's like, well, is there one correct set of virtues for every human being and every culture, in every society? And can we kill fruit flies? It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. In fact, I don't know that anybody makes a convincing argument for that. Okay, so here's another thing about virtue theories, virtue-based theories to keep in mind, is that unlike principle-based theories, virtue theories don't aim to tell you what the moral truths are. So let's look at a simple utilitarianism. the correct action in a situation, in situation S, right? So we have a particular situation. The correct action in that situation is going to be whatever maximizes benefit for the greatest number of sentient beings. I'm including animals in that, just to make it nice and broad. Okay. Well, so you apply that to any particular situation. You apply that principle to any particular situation, and you're going to have facts, moral facts, about what anyone ought to do under those same conditions, right? So as long as you know the conditions and you have the principle, you can apply the principle to the conditions, and you can get a result that applies to everyone. Anybody who finds themselves in that set of conditions is going to have to do the same thing. So there is an answer about what the morally correct thing to do is under those exact conditions. So if you take all of the possible sets of conditions that there are, this is an abstraction, but if you take all of the possible, the set of all possible conditions that you could encounter, and that's going to be a huge set, and you apply this principle to every single one of those sets, you're going to get a definitive answer about what the morally correct thing to do in that situation is. What is the moral fact in that situation? And then that applies to everybody who finds themselves under those conditions. So that's going to be a very large set of moral truths. But ultimately, if you had the computational resources to either in your brain or through artificial means, if you had the computational resources to run a calculation like that, you could identify the set of moral truths given the theory. Same thing for Kantianism. If you have a principle, you can apply that to some set of conditions, and then you can get an answer about what the morally correct thing to do in that situation is for everybody, right? And then you can just say, all right, if you ever find yourself under these conditions, this is the morally correct thing to do, right? I mean, it's not practically possible for us to do those kinds of calculations because we can't even conceive of, as human beings, we're so limited, we can't conceive of every possible set of conditions that could happen and then apply that principle and then come up with the set of moral truths. But objectively speaking, there is that set. It exists, right? If you have a principle-based theory. Virtue-based theories don't make that claim. You don't have some set of conditions that you apply a principle to and then figure out what the moral truths are. Even if you had all the computational power in the universe, you could never run that calculation because virtue ethicists don't have principles to apply to conditions. Rather, what you end up with is something like, here's a character. This is what novels do, right? Literature is this wonderfully exploratory territory for virtue ethics. And not surprisingly, a lot of virtue ethicists really love literature because it's kind of like doing these calculations with a principle-based theory. You take a character, you give them certain kinds of traits, and then you put them into certain scenarios and you kind of see what they do, right? I mean, writing a novel is not completely that, but there is a whole lot of that. Right. So I have a friend who writes, and he does a lot of world building. And what he likes to do, in fact, I have a couple of friends who write, and they're both very similar in this regard. And I don't think there's any one particular way to write, but this is what they do. And I have a tendency to be this way too. Yes, I do write fiction. But what's important is you sort of figure out, what is your world like? What are people like in this world? What is your society like? You figure out all these things that influence human behavior. Are there geopolitical elements? Like, so one of my friends really, really loves foreign relations and political stuff, right? He's a political scientist. So he's really into that. So all of his world building and all of his stories involve all kinds of crazy stuff like treaties and, trade, all kinds of trade negotiations and that kind of stuff, right? So he's got all that stuff figured out. He's got spreadsheets upon spreadsheets of all of this political and economic stuff for these worlds that he builds. And then he develops characters and then he puts them into these worlds. He's like, all right, now what's going to happen? I'm just going to think about what would this person do under these conditions. And the story is character driven in that way. I have another friend who does the same thing. He likes to write fantasy stuff. And he works with magical systems. So apparently there are all these different kinds of magical systems. And he tries to figure out what are the magical systems that are relevant to the story that I want. So I have this sort of set of principles. I have a character. And I'm going to see how he responds to this world where magic is this certain way, right? And it's fun, right? It's really fun to sort of like play with those things. So that's the closest thing. Literature is the closest thing that we have to being able to run some sort of calculation about what is the best way to be if you want to be a moral being. Well, imagine a scenario, imagine a person with certain characteristics and put them in that scenario. That's the best thing you can do. So it's not going to produce, doing something like that, like this process that I'm using as an example of writing a novel, it is certainly not going to tell us what the moral truths are. It's only going to tell us what a person with that character, that particular character, is going to do, is very likely to do under certain sets of conditions, right? What they have the disposition, how they're disposed to behave under certain sets of conditions. Now, the thing is, virtue ethicists or just virtue-based theories are all going to sort of have subscribe to the same idea, which is this, that, and it just flew out of my head. I'm getting old. I am old. That we're disposed to behave in certain ways. Good. We're not looking for the set of moral truths. A virtue theory is never going to give you that. It's never going to tell you exactly what the right thing to do in any situation is. The only thing that it's going to tell you is, if you're this kind of person, under these conditions, you're much more likely to do the morally correct thing, whatever that is. So it's kind of nice because you don't have to... Getting notification. What are these notifications on my computer? I don't know. Dumb things. My life is dum 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 dum. All right, so we don't necessarily have to worry about what is the right thing to do in any given situation. We have to worry about what kind of person do I want to be, and what kind of person is more likely to live a morally upstanding life, and then I want to try to be that kind of person. We don't have to, it's a relief in a way, because we don't have to know what the moral truths are. We don't have to run these calculations and try to figure it all out. We're just like, okay, look, that's beyond my pea brain. I'm a little bitty human being with this tiny little brain, and running those kinds of calculations is difficult. So maybe what's good is just to shape my own character, shape my own virtues, get rid of my vices, right? Shape my own virtues so that when I find myself under certain conditions, I'm going to be able to behave appropriately. And I'm much more likely to produce morally appropriate behavior. That's the essence of virtue virtue theories. All right, so now, this doesn't mean that virtue ethicists are not objectivists. They are, right? So there can be a set of moral truths that's objectively true out there, regardless of what people think, and there's no mind dependence at all. It's just mind independent moral facts in the world. There is still some fact about what the morally correct thing to do in any situation is. So you can still be a virtue ethicist and be an objectivist, right? It just means that you might not know. Virtue ethics might not bring you the capacity to know what the moral truths are. But your behavior is more likely to conform to those moral truths if you're virtuous, right? So virtue ethics is an objectivist theory, but it is what we call a version of moral particularism. And moral particularism is just the view that there aren't these... I've got notes in the lecture notes where you can go and you can review that section in the text. I think it was in chapter 4, where it talks about particularism. But particularism is just this idea that there aren't these general moral principles that are going to give you answers in any given situation. You have to be in a particular situation. It's the entire set of circumstances that you're under, all of the details, including who you are as a person, right? If you're a virtue ethicist, this sort of particularism is going to also take into consideration, like, not only your external factors, but your internal factors. What kind of person are you? what ways do you tend to react under certain conditions? How are you disposed to behave, right? So taking all of that into consideration, there is a right way to behave in a situation, and you may or may not be able to do it, right? But it is a version of particularism because we're not positing moral principles. Okay, so one thing that's interesting. I don't know if any of you have in your lives ever suffered any trauma, but one thing that happens when you experience severe trauma, you can sometimes develop post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And if you have PTSD, your brain kind of is broken. It's like having a brain injury, because what happens then is you overreact to certain conditions, under certain conditions, right? So circumstances that remind you of trauma, or that trigger that basically remind you of trauma, or that make you afraid. You have a tendency to overreact in those situations, and it is very, very, very difficult to change that behavior. It can be done, but it is extremely painstaking. It is very difficult. So there are a lot of interventions. There's like medications. There's a lot of different things that people with PTSD have to go through therapy-wise, but it never really goes away. I mean, it's a chronic condition, and you might master yourself under a certain limited set of conditions, but you get into a whole new set of conditions and you've never handled them before, so all of a sudden you're overreacting again. So this is considered a vice. This is actually not. This is a problem. This is a real problem for people who, if you want to be a virtue theorist, you're going to have to try to decide, what is it possible then for people with PTSD to ever be virtuous? Because it looks like there's some things they just have absolutely no control over. Same thing with people who have certain psychological conditions, like Tourette's or obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So these states that we would consider, I want to say abnormal, but non-standard, right? Not necessarily something, I guess, non-standard. There's some discussion in philosophy about how to refer to these conditions, whether they're abnormal or whether they're non-standard. I don't know. I don't know what term I want to use for that. But they're conditions that don't affect the general population and like most people, right? So there's still a minority of people who suffer from these conditions. So we'll say that it's non-standard. What about these people? I mean, it's one thing to try to develop patience or courage or tenacity or, kindness, empathy. These seem like the kinds of things that we can work on developing in our lives, and that virtue ethicists say that we are morally obligated to develop these things. But what about people who just have things in their brains that they can't control? Some of us are made that way, and some of us are born that way. Does this mean we'll never be virtuous? Does this mean that morality is unattainable? I don't know. It's a question. And you might think disability rights advocates might have a problem with this too, because you might think that something like autism gives you unusual or non-standard responses to certain things. There's a whole strain of thought that says, well, that's abnormal. That's not virtuous behavior. And so autistic people are not capable of being truly virtuous. Morality is beyond their scope. But then there's a community that says, well, no, they're not neurotypical, but that doesn't mean they're abnormal in the strictest sense. There's just a range of human diversity, right? You might just say, look, we call it non-neurotypical and neurotypical, but you might think that there's just a range of ways that people are, and they have more or less control over certain things, and they have varying responses to various stimuli just in their natural state. non-trained responses. And that's not wrong, right? So this goes back again to what's considered virtuous for somebody who's on the spectrum? I don't know, right? So this is another issue. This is kind of an issue. I know I haven't gotten into issues with the issues that they're talking about in the book, but I think these are actually more interesting issues that you might want to think about with a virtue ethics. It's like, it seems intuitive. It seems like, yeah, we should just develop these positive character traits, and that's more likely to produce moral behavior. But then you start thinking about what virtues should we be emphasizing, right? So if you think that moral education involves training people in the way of virtue, then you have to think about the diversity that you have in any given collection of students, right? And is there going to be one virtue that everybody should pursue? Is there? I don't know. I mean, there've got to be some ways to answer some of these issues, but there's not an obvious answer here, right? So this is just kind of a variation on what are the virtues, right? How do we even know what they are? And we try to, and one thing that virtue ethicists do have going for them is that they do try to at least base their theory on good empirical data, right? So what are human beings actually like? What is something that is part of natural human behavior? What are things that we just naturally think of as positive character traits? Okay, so we can work with that. But then we have to recognize, too, that a lot of what we think is just natural is actually socially constructed. So in another time period, it was considered vicious to be gay. You could not be a virtuous individual as long as you were gay. Nowadays, we're just like, that's not a virtue or a vice. It's just part of human diversity, right? How about transgenderism? There are still people out there. There are actually unfortunately, quite a lot of people who think, well, somebody who was assigned the gender of male at birth, if they say, forget it, I want to wear dresses, that they're doing something completely non-virtuous. In fact, there are people out there who say that if you are transgender, there's no way you can be a virtuous person. There's so much wrong with you at that point. There's so much wrong with you that you there's nothing redeemable. There are some people who actually hold these kinds of views, that there's something so wrong with you that you can't even attain any level of virtue. Well, that just seems completely false, right? It just is false. I know transgender people who are really quality human beings and who I would consider virtuous. So these are some issues with virtue theory. They seem to be a little bit more sensitive to things that you would consider maybe social constructions rather than something natural. So this is kind of a little bit of a segue into Aristotle. So we're going to talk about Aristotle. Aristotle he's really who we consider like the first virtue ethicist in the Western philosophical tradition. He has a pretty robust virtue theory that he developed, and that was really a very predominant view for many, many hundreds of years. And there are still Aristotelians today. But he had a really interesting perspective on some of these questions that I'm asking, right? So I'm like, how do we determine which virtues are there natural tendencies that we should sort of develop, or are there socially constructed realities that we need to try to conform ourselves to? And which ones are the natural tendencies and which ones are the socially programmed things? I mean, it's really hard to sometimes distinguish these things. There are a lot of people who say, well, gender is just a natural thing. And then there are a whole bunch of other people who say, no, in fact, biological sex is a biological thing, and that's a natural thing. But gender is a social institution, right? Gender is a social entity, and so it's socially constructed. So how you express femininity, or how you express masculinity, or how you go about being a woman socially, that's a social construction. And it changes from society to society, right? So there doesn't seem to be any like real natural biological component to that. And of course, it kind of depends on what we mean by natural too. So social norms and social dynamics are a natural thing for a social species. But usually when people are talking about natural stuff, they're talking about biological stuff. So let's talk about Aristotle. So Aristotle had the interesting view that he thought that everything in nature had a proper function. Okay, so now this just seems kind of odd. If you think of the universe as coming about just in virtue of the laws of physics and some matter and an explosion and this deterministic sort of rolling out of galaxies and planets and people and sheep, right? I don't know why I picked sheep, I just did. Amoebas. If you think that the universe sort of came into being that way, then it doesn't seem like there's necessarily a particular function that anything in nature has, right? I mean, you might want to like say, I mean, how can I put this? You might have an ecological function. So you have, for instance, when they killed off all the wolves in Yellowstone many years ago, they suddenly started having problems, all kinds of ecological problems, because you ended up with an overabundance of prey, and the overabundance of prey had a negative impact on the flora, right? So the grass and the various vegetation there, and that had a negative effect on rivers, right? So you had this like catastrophic weird effect. Because there were no apex predators. So once they reintroduced apex predators into Yellowstone, I think it was like back in the 80s, the early 80s, they started to see a radical change in the landscape itself because that ecological niche was now filled again. And so things were functioning to keep a proper ecological order. Now, if you want to look at something in terms of their ecological function, then you can say, oh, sure, it makes sense that things have a proper function, ecologically speaking. But that's not what Aristotle had in mind. Aristotle had in mind just, period. You have a proper function in virtue of the fact that you exist. It's like, what's my function, right? What does that mean? So Aristotle said, well, okay, look, he was actually a very keen observer. He gathered all kinds of empirical data about the world. I mean, he had so much information, so much knowledge, and he had so many writings that we don't even have today because a lot of them burned in the Library of Alexandria. It's very sad. So what we have today is just a fraction of the work that Aristotle actually produced, but he was a keen observer of nature. And it seemed to him that the proper function of a human being is to, well, okay, so the proper function of any being, let's put it this way, let's start more general. The proper function of any being is to flourish. What is flourishing? Well, whatever you would consider, like if you look at a human being, you say, is this human being flourishing? Well, I don't know. I mean, if they're living on the streets and they're eating out of a dumpster, they don't appear to be flourishing. If, on the other hand, they're graduating with a degree, they're buying a house, they're getting married, they're having children, they're doing all these like totally socially predictable sort of things, we tend to think that these people are flourishing. If they're happy, if they're generally very happy people, then we think, okay, that person is flourishing. They are doing something that's meaningful with their lives. They seem to have a positive outlook from day to day. I mean, that seems like a person who's flourishing, right? Aristotle was like, no, flourishing is to satisfy. Okay, let me back up. So he didn't think that our function was to flourish. Okay, so I misspoke. Flourishing is to satisfy. What it means to flourish is to satisfy your proper function. Oh man, my nose itches. Ugh. All right, to flourish is to satisfy your proper function. Well, what is the function of human beings? Well, Aristotle looked around and he's like, look, human beings seem to have this like this thing about them that no other animal appears to have. And he understood that humans are just animals, right? He believed that. And so he looked around and he was just like, well, human beings have a tendency that we have this capacity that nothing else on this planet appears to have. And that is the capacity for reason. Okay? So our proper function seems to be ordering ourselves, ordering our lives in accordance with reason. And if we do that, then we're flourishing, right? So to flourish is to fulfill your proper function, and the human's proper function is to order their lives and their societies, their personal lives, their societies, to order things according to the dictates of reason. Okay. And one of the things that he said was, look, there are these ways of being that satisfy that function better than other ways of being. So if the function is to order our environments and ourselves and our lives according to the dictates of reason, there are some ways of being that are going to satisfy that. And then there are some that are not. Okay, so shooting up heroin, living on the street, that doesn't seem to be a recipe for flourishing. That doesn't seem to be a recipe for ordering your life according to the dictates of reason, right? So that way of being is not considered an ideal way of being. An ideal way of being is one that helps you attain this sort of kind of flourishing that we just mentioned, right? Somebody who's happy, somebody who's satisfied that their life is meaningful, and that they're doing meaningful work, that they have enough financial resources to be comfortable, okay? That they have social connections that are meaningful, right? These kinds of things that we tend to think, that's what human flourishing consists in. So Aristotle thought that too, but he also thought that these things were the product of the capacity to reason. And he's not wrong. I mean, ordering society in the way that we order society is a very distinctive way of doing it. And it may look like that's just the dictates of reason. I don't know. I mean, if you look at, there are animal societies that are just highly structured and ordered and organized as well. Do they reason? Who knows? I mean, this could just be innate behavior as well. So, all right. So, Aristotle divided virtues into two kinds. He said there are intellectual virtues and then there are practical virtues. Okay, so intellectual virtues are the things like that we're learning in this class, right? So you want to only believe things in accordance with the evidence, right? So if there's no evidence for QAnon, then you ought not believe that. Okay, it's vicious to believe in QAnon given that there's no evidence. Okay, it is virtuous to believe that something that we have evidence for. Wearing a mask prevents the spread of COVID. They have substantial evidence for that, right? So wearing a mask prevents the spread of COVID. It's virtuous to believe that, it's virtuous to believe that because of the evidence, right? So if your belief is based on the evidence, that's considered an intellectual virtue. Being aware of what you don't, being aware not of what, but that you don't know a lot of things and adjusting your attitudes and your behavior accordingly, that's an intellectual virtue. We call it intellectual humility. So I don't start talking to an economist and start telling them the way they ought to do things and what they ought to think, because I'm very well aware of the fact that I am lacking a whole lot of knowledge in economics. I mean, I've taken a couple of economics courses, graduate level economics courses, but that does not qualify me to have a really robust opinion about what economists should or should not be doing or thinking or saying or whatever, okay? So intellectual humility is I'm going to recognize where my knowledge ends and I'm going to respect that boundary. I'm not going to overstep that boundary and pretend like I know more than I do. Now, the world would be a better place if there were more people who are intellectually humble, but get on Twitter on any given day and you'll see that there's a whole lot of emptiness when it comes to intellectual humility online. People think they know a shit ton more than they actually do. And they got to talk about it. That's nothing that they know. All right. So those are intellectual virtues. Now, what really matter for morality, though, for Aristotle, are the practical virtues. Okay. Now, practical virtues are the kinds of things like patience, generosity, kindness, courage. Okay. So these are the things that we tend to associate with virtue. And these are what he calls the practical virtues. And he calls them practical virtues because they require practice. So nobody is just born courageous, patient, kind, yada, 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 right? Nobody's just born that way. We have to become that way. And according to Aristotle, we become that way the same way you become good at a sport, by practice and practice and practice. And I really kind of I like this sport analogy. I used to be a fencer. That's sword fighting, competitive sword fighting. Not big swords like, rapiers and sabers and stuff, little ones. And there really is only one way to get really good at fencing. And that is to hire a very high level coach, like an Olympic level coach, and take private lessons every day. And then practice for hours every day, right? So, but it really matters. Like you're never going to get good at fencing if you don't take the private lessons. Because you have to have, fencing is an interaction. It happens, it's a dynamic space. And you can't learn how to do things just from running drills. You have to actually engage with another person. And you don't want to fence with people who are not as good as you who are as good or not as good as you, because you don't learn anything. You just develop these habits that then are really hard to get out of. Because if you just keep doing the same thing and you get lazy, you can do some really lazy stuff and maybe get a point on somebody that you're fencing who's less skilled than you. But you're not really developing a skill set. The only way to develop a skill set is to fence with people who are much better than you, which means you're going to lose like all the time. And you have to be okay with that. It's called sportsmanship. But you also have to work with a highly skilled coach, one-on-one, at least an hour, every day. And that can be really pricey, but who cares, right? Let's put that to the side. I'm just thinking about it because I would love to be fencing right now, but I just can't afford it. Oh my God, I love fencing. But it's you have to have some disposable income to do it because it is not cheap. Private lessons, you're usually paying about $1 a minute for a private lesson. And yeah, it's... So, but with the repetition. So you have to develop muscle memory. You have to get so good at it that's just habitual, right? And this is what Aristotle thinks that virtue is. It's because I have a fruity thing going on here. Of course, I open it up. It's going to attract all the fruit flies. So Aristotle thought that that's what developing virtue was like. It's like getting a fencing coach and then practicing. And so there's a certain amount of privilege that people are going to have who have people in their lives who are virtuous, right? So he thought that this had to start in childhood. So if you did not have a teacher or a mentor or a parent in early childhood who was a virtuous person and who could act like your fencing coach to develop the skill set in you, he didn't think that you were capable of becoming a virtuous person. Once you reached adulthood, Aristotle said, it's too late. It's too late. You're just never going to develop the virtues. You're just doomed to be an immoral buffoon. Now, there's a little bit of truth in that, but it's not as fatalistic as he seemed to think. But he really did believe that you don't start early in childhood, you're never going to be a virtuous person. So I think there is lots of evidence that that's not the case. Maybe Aristotle's observational evidence was lacking because he had a very restricted sort of social context that he was in. So we know nowadays that that's just not true. People can have all kinds of radical changes at all stages of life, right? So you can go from being a completely vicious to being a much more virtuous individual. And there are lots of stories of these kinds of transformative sort of things, right? So I think Aristotle was wrong about that. But he was right about the fact that it takes practice, and that you need somebody in your life who is skilled to guide you and to push you and to challenge you. If you're never challenged morally, you're always just going to kind of think, well, I'm just as good as the people around me, so it's easy to just be exactly the way the people around you are. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily a moral person. That just means that you're conforming to whatever the standard is in that particular context, which may not be a good moral standard, right? Okay, so practice turns virtuous behavior into a habit, right? It's like muscle memory if you're doing a sport. You just get to the point you're just disposed. So one of the most startling things that happened to me when I started fencing seriously is that after so many lessons and running so many drills and fencing, I would get out there and I would fence with people who were better than me. I always fenced people who were better than me. So I lost a lot. This is in practice. But one of the things that really, really just shook me is I would be on the fencing strip, and I would be, fencing with my opponent, and I would just start doing things without even thinking. Like my body would just take over and start, parry, riposte, whatever. My body would just do things. And there were a couple times where I would just freeze because it would be so startling that my body just performed and my mind was like not directing it. And my coach would be like, "What? Why are you just?" He was Romanian. And he'd be like, "Why you do this? Why you do that? Why you just stop?" Because it was just as a person who's interested in human behavior and who's interested in cognition and neurology and all of the brain stuff, it just shocked me. I was like, that's what it feels like. It's like so zen. It's just like you're just there. Your brain is on autopilot, and there's this part of your brain that's not conscious, but that's directing your actions. And it's like you're just this passenger, and you're moving so fast. It's like you could not think these things. You could not think through and strategize and plan out and execute these actions in time to actually, defend yourself. You have to just let your body do it because your body knows, right? So there's a part of your brain that's not a conscious part of your brain that has been trained through repeated interactions with their fencing coach who slaps you on top of the head and says, "Why you do that?" I don't know, because I suck. He used to do that. He would bop me on the head. He'd lift his mask up and he'd bop me on the head and he'd say, "Why you do that?" I don't know. If I could give you an explanation, I probably wouldn't anyway, because then you would just slap me and tell me to be quiet. My first fencing coach was Romanian, and then my second one was Russian. Oh, my goodness. Feisty. All right. So there's these really feisty men with like these really zen cores. I mean, that's what I aspire to be. Feisty on the surface, but totally zen inside. Just that would be nice. But that's what Aristotle wanted us all to be. I have to tie this back into the lecture because I would just sit here and talk about fencing all night because I love it so much. I'm like getting sweaty just thinking about how much I love fencing. It's terrible. It's like me and fast cars. You talk about fast cars, I'm like, you talk about fencing, I'm like, oh my God, swords, yes. Oh, stabbing people, oh, it's so good. I fenced saber, though. Saber is not a stabbing weapon, it's a slicing weapon. So bopping and slapping and slicing, Okay. So, all right. Good. Okay. So, hopefully this makes sense. Pretty straightforward. Now, your book is going to, the lecture notes present a little more detail as usual, and the book is got a little bit different take, same information, but just a little bit different perspective. So I encourage you to read the book as well as looking at the lecture notes. All right, so developing the practical virtues involves knowing what the virtues are and how they manifest in your behavior. You cannot develop a virtue if you don't know what it is, right? If you don't know what patience is, if you don't have some understanding of what patience is and what it looks like, you're never going to be able to develop it, which is why you need a guide, according to Aristotle. This is why you need a coach, right? Like a virtue coach, like you would have a fencing coach, right? So this is why you need somebody to observe so that you can see what patience looks like and how it manifests. And you can look at how all of these things sort of interplay in your character, right? So you need somebody to show you. And he says we learn through example. And we do. I mean, Aristotle cracks me up. He was really a keen observer of everything. Nature, humans, everything. He was really, really good. I mean, he was like the Sherlock of observation. And so he just assumes that everybody else does that too and needs that too, which is kind of funny. It's a little bit solipsistic, but anyway. Okay, so first thing, knowing what virtues are and how they manifest and having an example, right, is how we know. Number two, intending to behave virtuously for the sake of the virtue itself. Now, look, if you're just being courageous because you want to impress somebody, Aristotle's going to say, yeah, you don't get brownie points for that. That's not the kind of practice that you need to be engaged in. You need to be engaged in practicing courage for the sake of courage, not because you want to impress people, okay? So if you are practicing virtues for some reason other than to develop the virtues themselves, then you're completely missing the point, according to Aristotle, and I think that's probably true, right? Okay, number three, all virtuous actions are directly caused by desires that are directly caused by virtues. So our virtues, our character traits, shape and mold our desires. And so all of our behaviors, our desires are what motivate our behaviors, motivate our actions. So these motivational states, desires are motivational states, these motivational states are going to dictate how we behave. And if virtue is driving the bus, we're on to happy land, right? We're going down the moral freeway. If it's vice that's driving the short bus, we're headed off the cliff. Okay? Me and my stupid metaphors. Okay, so being virtuous takes a lot of practice and it takes years. It takes a lot of years. So anybody here who's ever practiced a sport, if you've ever done a martial arts really are the best way to sort of get this virtue ethics sort of thing, which is another reason why it's interesting that a lot of the Asian philosophies go hand in hand with martial arts, because there's something about developing. So I've done a couple of martial arts. Fencing is considered a martial art, even though it's not an Eastern martial art. But I also did Taekwondo when I was in high school. I went pretty far. I was actually a brown belt, red belt in Taekwondo. It's a red belt, but it's right before a black belt. So I went pretty far in it before I quit and started dancing instead. Whatever. But there's something about the way that you develop your skill set in a martial art that is very, very, very much the same way that you develop virtues in a virtue theory, right? So these various Eastern philosophies that are virtue-based are also very much tied up with, in many, many ways, a martial art. So it's interesting. So if any of you have practiced a martial art, then you'll have an idea of what I'm talking about the kind of practice that you have to engage in to develop a certain way of being. So a martial art develops you physically. Like I said, when I'm fencing and my brain is just doing stuff, it's like, okay, well, I'm doing this, and my brain's just like, conscious brain is not directing this. It's part of my brain that's, been trained. What was I going to say? Jesus, I hate it when I do this. It gets worse as you get older. Martial art. Da, da, da. So, fencing, yeah. Oh, the idea is that just like when you're you're performing a martial art, you're practicing or you're engaging in some sort of a competition with a martial art. You're just responding. You're just disposed to respond a certain way under certain conditions. You just do. You don't stop and strategize it. Martial arts aren't like that. They train a part of your brain that bypasses your conscious decision making. You're just shaped to behave a certain way under certain conditions. It's a type of conditioning, right? Programming. It's a type of brain programming. And developing virtue is exactly the same way. It really is. Okay. Now, Aristotle had some views about a virtue being sort of this midpoint between excess and deficiency, right? So that's on page 228 of the text. I'm just going to let you read that part. I don't think that's that important because we're not really talking about Aristotle's theory. We're not getting into his theory for the sake of his theory. We're talking about Aristotle as an example of a virtue ethics. So I really don't care about that particular detail of his theory. Okay, the idea is that there's just this balance. Like there's this perfect state of balance that you have to achieve. So courage is a perfect state of balance between fear, like cowardice, and recklessness, right? So if you have too much courage, I guess, if you're too much on the excess side of courage, you're going to be reckless. But if you're too much on the deficiency side of courage, you're going to be cowardly, right? So he's like, there's this perfect balance. So the idea, again, is just like a martial art. There's this sort of balance that you achieve. Your state of being, your psychological, emotional state of being achieves a sort of balance, and that's where virtue lies. So it's very, very, very similar to some Eastern philosophies. Okay. Now let's pit these against principle-based views. So, virtue ethical theories do sort of address some issues with principle-based views. So, first of all, a principle-based moral theory they're incomplete. So, this issue with incompleteness is they certainly haven't accomplished the task of telling us what all the moral truths are. And they conflict with one another. So, because virtue ethics doesn't claim to be able to tell us what the moral truths are, it doesn't suffer from this particular version of incompleteness. Okay. Overemphasis on impartiality. So principle-based theories require us to be detached from our emotions or other affective states. And the implicit assumption is that emotional or affective states are irrelevant to coming to the morally correct action. Well, a virtue-based theory, however, is going to be more likely to work with emotional states and say, no, it's not lack of emotion that is important for proper behavior, properly moral behavior. But what matters is that you have this sort of emotional balance. You find a certain emotional balance. So Aristotle would say that, right? Aristotle would say, look, you're bringing your emotions into balance, right? There's sort of, it's almost like a state of Zen, right? So this balance, and you're not cutting yourself away from your emotions because you don't want to do that. Your emotions are an important part of who you are, and emotions carry information about the world. We have emotions that respond to external stimuli. We have emotions as a way of getting information about our social and physical environments. So you don't want to cut your emotions off because then you're cutting off a whole stream of information. So a virtue ethicist is going to say, no. You just need to find the proper balance. And it's in that balance that then you can behave in a moral way, which I think makes sense to me. Okay. Number 3, principle-based theories sort of suffer from a distortion of human nature. So people who perfectly obey the moral rules that are posited by principle-based or rule-based theories, they look like complete weirdos, right? So think about a perfect utilitarian. Someone who's a perfect utilitarian would probably donate all of their non-essential organs to other people for organ transplants. They would probably donate most of their income. They would probably live close to the poverty line because of what they give to others, right? So they would be like in complete they would be like in a state of perpetual self-sacrifice. But that's not the way people typically behave. That just seems really weird. People who would be perfect utilitarianisms would be sort of unrecognizable to the rest of us. We'd be like, who the fuck are you? What planet did you drop down from, right? This is just not normal. This is weird. Or you think about a perfect deontologist, like a perfect Kantian. Well, a perfect Kantian would be like, why, yes, Nazis, let me tell you that I do have Jews hiding in my basement. Would never lie to a Nazi. I mean, come on. Who of us would be like, who of us would hide Jews and then not lie about it? If you're the kind of person who's going to hide Jews in your basement during the Holocaust, then you're certainly not going to be the kind of person who's going to be like, oh my goodness, I can't lie to the Nazi because, you know, that breaks the categorical imperative. So even though I've gone to all this trouble to hide these people and to try to save their lives, now I'm going to just give up because of morality. That's weird. I'm like, that's just weird. Honey, if that's the way you want to be, this is just weird. Okay. So that's a criticism of these principle or rule-based theories. Virtue ethicists are like, look, we want a moral theory that works with the way people actually are. And we want the way to understand how people actually are based on science. The science of human beings, you know, cognitive psychology and cognitive science and all these different wonderful disciplines that we have. Let's take advantage of that and let's have a moral theory that's consistent with the way people actually are. We don't expect them to become weirdos. Like a good moral theory shouldn't require us to become inhuman, right? Should just maximize what's best about humanity instead of cutting it out. No emotions, no, you know, lying to save the lives of vulnerable people. Oh, there's a human way of being that's the best way of being, according to the virtue ethicist. Okay, so a final problem with principle-based theories, according to the virtue ethicist, is that they don't give you much of an explanation for why people should be motivated to be moral. Why? Why are people motivated to do moral things? This is actually a really difficult question to answer. In fact, I spent a good portion of time researching this issue, the problem of moral motivation, for my first set of doctoral exams, because it's really perplexing. What motivates people to be moral? Do we have to have a desire to be moral? Is there just something about moral judgments that are inherently motivating? Some people have that view. It's weird, right? But the virtue ethicist has a really easy solution. It's just like, well, people are motivated to behave in ways that are more likely to conform to moral truth or the moral standard, whatever the morally correct thing to do is, the more virtuous they are, right? And virtue shapes desires, which are motivational states. So if we spend time developing the virtues, then we are going to be motivated to behave in ways that are more likely to be morally correct. Simple. Okay, so I'm going to end there because this is getting long. There are a couple of problems for virtue-based theories that I have tacked on to the lecture outline. I'm just going to let you go through this. It's self-explanatory. It's pretty easy, and you don't need me to tell it to you. You can read it. So, good. All right. Thanks for hanging in there with this somewhat long lecture. I hope it made sense. Okay. I will be posting the lecture for the feminist ethics sometime at the beginning of next week. Okay.